Good morning. I'm Dolly Duffy, the Executive Director of your Alumni Association. Thanks for being here today for our first big seminar of the weekend, ND Perspectives, which is really aptly named, Campaign 2016, an election like no other. The past year or so, I'm sure you're like me and so many others, I've just been following this with great intrigue. It's like nothing we've ever seen before. The drama, the intrigue. I have teenage girls, and there's less drama at my house. And it's not showing any signs of stopping. Bernie Sanders continues to fight Hillary Clinton for the Democratic nomination. We're in the uncharted territory of having the unpredictable Donald Trump as the Republican nominee. It's just really great fun and great sport. When we thought a lot about ND Perspective in its early stages, we wanted compelling topics with really incredible speakers. And I have to say, today is a chart topper with this group right here. We wanted to make sure that we had alumni and some of the greatest faculty from the university, and we've done that as well. So I'd like to introduce you to the person that will moderate the panel today, Christina Wolbrecht. She's a political science professor and the director of the Rooney Center for the Study of American Democracy here at Notre Dame. Her areas of expertise are American politics, political parties, and women in politics. And after spending a few minutes with Christina in the green room, I'll tell you, she also could be a bit of a comedian. She's got a great sense of humor, which is exactly what we'll need to cover this topic today. So, without further ado, I'll hand it off to Christina.
Thank you, Dolly. It's very generous. So I want to join Dolly in welcoming you all back home to Notre Dame, and thank you for coming out this morning. I just can't imagine what would have stimulated this much interest in an election year. And Dolly's exactly right. We have such a great panel for you. I think this really represents some of the very best about your alma mater, which is to say faculty who aren't just great for Notre Dame, but are nationally recognized experts. If you wanted to choose people to talk about this election from all over the country, not just from this campus, these are the people you'd want to talk to. And then our alums who are out there doing amazing things as leaders in their communities, in our country, and in the world. And so I really feel like this panel is such a great example of why we're just so very proud of Notre Dame. So I want to get out of the way so we can talk about this election. So I'm going to briefly introduce each of our panelists. We're going to start off with a couple of questions that I'll pose to them. And then about halfway through, we're going to open it up for your questions. So please, whatever we don't cover, be thinking about questions and be ready to come up to those mics about halfway through with your questions. And so to my furthest left, I'm sorry to say, Matt, is Matt Schlapp of the class of 1990. We were joking about this back. As I said, Matt is an alum of Notre Dame. He is currently, among many things, chairman of the American Conservative Union, the ACU, which is a major organization in our politics. I have to say, I've been using your scores since graduate school, so so many important things. And a former political director for President George W. Bush in the early 2000s, and so we're just delighted to have Matt here today. Next is Luis Fraga. Luis is the Arthur Foundation Endowed Professor of Transformative Latino Leadership and the Joseph and Elizabeth Robbie Professor of Political Science here at Notre Dame. He is the co-director of our Institute for Latino Studies, and I can tell you one of our nation's leading experts on Latinos in politics, immigration, and other issues. Next, Katie Byrne Fallon, class of 1998. Current president of Oak Tree Strategies, and the former director of legislative affairs for President Obama. Her departure was a big enough deal to make, I believe, a full story in the New York Times. And then finally, my colleague Dave Campbell, who is Packy J.D. Professor of American Democracy and Chair of the Department of Political Science here at Notre Dame. Again, a nationally recognized expert on religion and politics, political socialization, and voting in American politics. And so again, it's hard for me to imagine a better combination of people to provide us some insight on this election. So I'm going to start, and I'll make up for Matt's placement, but maybe we'll start from the left and go this direction, by just asking each of our panelists to just comment on what so far you see as the biggest takeaway or lesson or even consequence of this dramatic election here in 2016. So I'll start with you, please.
Well, let me just say thank you for having me back to campus. As you all know, it's so special to be here. I had my 25th reunion last year and stayed in one of the dorms. How are your backs feeling this morning? For those of you who did that, I clearly had put on a little weight because that mattress was a little rough, but it was a great weekend. I'm sure you guys will have a great time. So my takeaway on politics are a couple of things. I'll be quick. Most of us who are supposed to know don't know. We figured that one out, right? Pretty unpredictable. I say the second thing is there's a strange dynamic going on in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. I'm a conservative and a Republican. On my side, what usually happens when you elect a Democratic president is it makes the Republicans come together. And I think Mitch McConnell and John Boehner, who was just on campus, they kind of figured that that's what would happen. Republicans tend to unite in opposition to a Democratic president like they did with Bill Clinton. And we can get into why this happened, right, politely. But I do think there was such a reaction to the Obama policies that he actually brilliantly split the Republicans, and we haven't seen this in modern times. So what you're dealing with on the Republican side is what would usually be a congealed unity against a president turned into complete frustration with Republican leaders in Congress who they feel were not doing enough to stop those policies. And that is basically the characteristic of what's happening on our side. And they're so, I don't think angry, I don't think mad, although some people are, I think they're so worried about things that they're willing to try something very radical and very new, which is what happened in our nominating process. I think the Democrats are very close to having the same scenario. And I think that's part of what Bernie Sanders is about. The only difference is on their side is most Democrats are pretty happy with President Obama. So they're not in so much of a fighting mood, but you can see just underneath the surface, there's a huge realignment going on.
Thank you. Luis.
Thank you very much, Christina, and it's wonderful to be here with all of you. Christina forgot to mention my most important qualification in being here, which is that I'm the father of a double domer. Wow. And soon to be a triple domer as well here, so I'm very proud of that. On certain parts of campus, I'm introduced as Isabel's father, which is really wonderful.
I apologize.
The main takeaway for me, broadly speaking, is the way in which it was entirely unexpected by anyone, social scientists, political pundits, I think even candidates in the election, I don't think they anticipated this, that there would be as much of an anti-establishment sentiment to particular parts of our electorate. There's clear dissatisfaction with the Republican, if we can agree, establishment, clear dissatisfaction with the Democratic establishment, and I wonder what it tells us about how much we become accustomed to day-to-day status quo politics. Clearly, important segments of our electorate, and interestingly, many young Americans, the next generation of leadership in both Republican and Democratic circles, think that something is wrong with our country and that traditional leadership doesn't get it. They want a different type of leadership. That presents a tremendous challenge to current leadership and a tremendous opportunity to see if they can gather those votes.
Thank you. Katie.
Thanks for having me. I'm coming back from my 20-year reunion in 2 years. I look forward to it, and hopefully I'll be invited to speak again today. So I want to touch on two things I think relate to something Matt said and something Professor Fraga said. I do think that the changes we're seeing in the ideological makeup of the parties is not necessarily related to President Obama, but is something much more deep-seated than that, and has very powerful implications for policy going forward. And I do think, not to talk on Matt's turf, but I do think that we might be at a crossroads in the Republican Party with what it means to be a conservative, and is conservatism to be rebranded in a more nativist, populist way as emblematic of the presidential nominee, or does it need to be recalibrated to talk more to more working class, middle class Americans? I think it has powerful implications for future policy in that when I was at the Obama White House, I worked very long and hard on the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, for instance, which is a 12-country free trade agreement that's waiting for Congress's approval. Over the last 2 decades, presidents have relied on Republicans in Congress to pass free trade. Is that going to be the case going forward? Is there going to be a re-examination of that key pillar of the Republican platform after this presidential election? I think that has huge ramifications for our domestic and global economy going forward. In saying that, this is going to sound a little bit conflicting. I think that elected politicians need to do a better job communicating how the policies that they stand for actually translate into benefits for working class Americans. The structural changes in our society have been so profound that there's a mismatch between what Congress can actually do to address them and what voters want to believe their elected politicians can do. And we have to be more honest about the limitations of federal policy in addressing those structural changes as elected leaders and as candidates, and instead work together with American business leaders to figure out ways that the social compact can be restored over time in ways that don't require a divided Congress or a presidential candidate to have legislation that gets blocked, and that are real changes that could make meaningful difference in working Americans' lives. And when in the distrust, the trust deficit is not just with government leaders, but with business leaders as well. And when you're seeing that, we need to work together to address some of those societal changes that are really making it difficult for working Americans to feel like they're benefiting from the economic recovery.
Thank you. Dave?
Well, I think there are lots of things that we could take away from the election so far. As has been noted, we could remark that all of us who think we know anything about politics obviously don't. But in saying that, maybe I'm too quick to make that joke, because I actually think that there are some aspects of the race thus far that has reminded us of things that we who study politics have actually known for a long time. And let me just highlight one that I think helps to explain the rise of Donald Trump, and it actually also helps to explain, I think, some of what's going on the Democratic side, and perhaps counterintuitively suggests that there might be hope for overcoming the sort of gridlock that we see in Washington. And that point is that most voters are not ideological. Most voters do not have a consistent ideology. This is something we have known for decades. We keep forgetting it, or at least the pundits, maybe they never knew it, I don't know. But, and that's how you can have people show up and vote for a candidate like Donald Trump in a Republican primary who says things that just don't fit into Republican orthodoxy, or might even be completely counter to Republican orthodoxy. How could that possibly be? And the answer is, well, most voters actually don't look for a candidate with a coherent ideology because they do not have a coherent ideology. They're looking for other things, symbolic attachments. They're looking for an affect, and certainly that's what you find in a candidate like Trump, who channels the anger that is obvious among a lot of Republican voters, at least. This idea that voters are not terribly ideological is also found on the Democratic side, because here's a shocker. It turns out when you actually look at the policy preferences of Bernie Sanders supporters versus Hillary Clinton supporters, there's a lot less difference than you might think. And on some issues, you could argue that the Sanders supporters are actually slightly more conservative than the Hillary supporters. You heard me right. They're slightly more conservative. It depends on the issue, and it depends on the particular context of the question, but it's not like these are people who are far off on the left and Hillary's people are right in the middle. Actually, there's a lot more overlap in their views than you might think. So what does that all mean? Well, you might think, well, that just means that we sort of have this hopelessly convoluted political system where there's no coherence, but I don't actually think that that's what we should take from it at all. I think what it suggests is the sort of gridlock that we observe in Washington does not reflect the actual policy preferences of the American public, and that perhaps there are policy solutions that could cut across the normal ideological lines, maybe not with quite the anger that we've observed in the last few weeks and months, but as things settle down after an election campaign, it suggests that there might actually be hope for productive solutions that are not rooted in our current concept of what's on the left and what's on the right, but actually might transcend those normal ideological divisions and boundaries.
Thank you. So as you can see, there's just so much to talk about. Let me direct one question specifically to you, Katie, and then if others want to sort of jump in. We've heard a lot about campaign finance and the role of money in elections, in this election in particular. Citizens United, et cetera. From your perspective, sort of, how is the campaign finance landscape changing? What effects do you think sort of the constant chase for money, or not chase for money, has on elections and policymaking at this point in our history?
I think there's multi dimensions to this question, but I think one of the most important dialogues we're going to have after this presidential contest is whether or not money in politics needs to be revisited. And as you all know, the Supreme Court ruled not once but twice to make it easier for private money to swirl into campaign elections. And given the difficulty, the difficulty in changing the law of the land, I think that the candidates are coming up with ways to empower smaller donors vis-a-vis larger corporate donors. And in 2008, President Obama started this so-called small donor revolution using digital media. And you see Bernie Sanders and Secretary Clinton doing the same on their campaigns. Bernie Sanders gets a lot of credit for perfecting the model. But it's really not going to replace the need for raising from corporate donors. And if you want to win and you want to be a contender, you have to play by the rules of the game. There's no point in taking yourself out of the game. And so until those rules change, these politicians have to spend an enormous amount of time fundraising. I think this is actually even more problematic in Congress, where members of Congress have to spend 25 to 50% of their time making phone calls and going to fundraisers. There was something like 2,800 fundraisers in DC last year alone, and I'm sure Matt and I ate terrible appetizers and in the run-up to election, that could be 75% of their time, and they have to do it to get reelected. That takes time away from them negotiating legislation. It takes time away from them helping their constituents with casework. And it's hugely costly, I think, for our democracy. But they have no incentive to put principle over politics, because this is the nature of the game. So I think there's one thing that can be done before any changes are made to the Supreme Court rulings, and that is empower the small donors through public financing tools. There's two cities in particular that are trying experiments on this. New York City is leveraging every small dollar donation with a 6 times match, up to $175. So candidates for New York City elections have an incentive to talk to as many constituents as possible to get their matching donations. Seattle is trying something where they give voters 3 vouchers worth $25 each that you can assign to different candidates you want to support in local elections. So we'll see how those work. I think there's legislation in Congress that sort of mimic these designs that have gone nowhere. But after this presidential election, who knows, there might be a very different conversation both sides of the aisle have, given the stigma that's developing because of the, this is like one, I think, plus side of the President Trump's, Donald Trump's,
I'm good.
I take it back. Of his debate around money and politics. Now, I will say that that Donald Trump is an outlier in 2 ways. One,
right.
He is self-funding, and it's very difficult to run and self-fund. And 2, he's spending very little on his campaign, and this is because he's getting a lot of attention through free media by mastering the cable news market and so that. So he's
Can I say one thing there? Do you mind? Real fast on the spending. So Jeb Bush spent $80 million on television. Donald Trump spent 18. I would even posit too that Donald Trump should have probably spent 0. And this whole idea that the press, there's a lot of bashing the press. How come they're giving him so much time? Here's the truth, and I think we all understand this, which is he is completely available at almost any time to all these shows. This isn't happening by accident. It's happening because it's a revolutionary way for a presidential candidate to engage all of us. He's on constantly, and they're going to give him that space. And as a matter of fact, you know, in most of the green rooms I'm at television shows, from the people on the left, there's a real frustration about how much they want to get Hillary Clinton on their show and how hard it is to get in touch with her. And oftentimes when they call the Trump operation, within a short period of time, the actual candidate will call that reporter back. So that's part of this whole turmoil and upheaval that's happening, which I think belies all this concern about who can buy the presidency.
Which has also been my observation just last week, that the cable news stations covered an empty podium waiting for Trump to come out and did not cut to a live speech Hillary Clinton was making on a policy rollout. So I don't know what to do about that, but I will say one more thing about the Supreme Court laws. You know, those were both very divided opinions, 5-4. Justice Ginsburg said in relation to campaign finance that, you know, America is not symbolized by, the symbol of America shouldn't be an eagle, it should be a pendulum, because once it swings so far one way, it's going to swing back the other in relation to those Supreme Court laws. And if Hillary is elected, which I hope she will be, she has vowed to appoint justices that will overturn Citizens United. So we could, in, you know, the next, hopefully 8 years, see changes to the law of the land.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I don't want to pivot, but there's so many interesting things I want to talk about. Luis, if I could direct a question to you, and again, if others wanted to chime in. Another sort of issue that's coming up in this election is changing demographics. Not only changing demographics as our country changes and evolves, but of course also who the different candidates can mobilize, who stays home on election day, who doesn't. Are there people coming out to vote that haven't voted in the past? Are there people who are staying home, et cetera? You're obviously a particular expert on Latino voters who are such a major part of so many swing states. So do you have some sort of insights or observations?
Sure, I'll offer two specific ideas. One is, it's very important to understand, and I think we all have an intuitive sense of this, and certainly the Trump campaign started out by emphasizing this. Our country is undergoing a major demographic shift. In 1970, 84% of people living in the United States, in 1970, 84% could claim a direct European origin. In the 2010 census, that number was down to 66%. And in 2040, not too many years from now, that number will be under 50%. And the primary source of growth is the growth in the Latino population. It was about 4% in 1970. It's now at about 17%, expected to be about 25% of the American public in 2040. That has already demonstrated effects in our elections and in our politics. One quick example. In 1980, Ronald Reagan won 56%, if you'll permit me, of the white vote, and with that won 44 states. In 2012, Mitt Romney won 59% of the white vote in the United States and got trounced by Barack Obama. The Obama campaign had an explicit strategy of strategically mobilizing African American voters, Latino voters, and won 7 states that they otherwise wouldn't necessarily have thought they might win. States like Florida, like Ohio, like Pennsylvania, like New Mexico, like Colorado, like Nevada, where in some states African American voters, in some states Latino voters, because of these changing demographics, become critical contributors to the outcome of the election. Those demographics, in part, I think, are a foundation for the sort of support some of the individuals supporting the Trump campaign see as important for the country to try to get a hold of. He started his campaign largely on the issue of immigration and the need to control our borders. For many Americans, that issue isn't just an issue of immigration. For many Americans, it's an issue about changing demographics too, and the way in which the country seems to be moving in a direction that makes them feel uncomfortable. So the question in this particular election will be how it is that the candidates ultimately, after the primaries, after the conventions, and during the general election, how they position themselves on this very important issue, whether it's with regards to immigration, whether it's regards to jobs and employment, whether it's in regards to education or healthcare, where they position themselves on this issue to see whether they're offering opinions and ideas and specific policy proposals that capture the future change that's likely to occur, or that seems to promote a divide between segments of the electorate, and I think make it more difficult for the country to move forward to embrace what is its inevitable reality.
Thank you. So, Matt, if I can turn to you, as chairman of the American Conservative Union, and given sort of your history and background, as Professor Campbell mentioned, there's been this issue about exactly how conservative Donald Trump is, and what this sort of means for the future of the conservative movement, and I think also for the future of the Republican Party. And I just, that's sort of I don't even know if there's a question there, but sort of how do you think about Donald Trump as a standard bearer for the Republican Party?
About this.
I bet you have. Just a little, just once in a while.
People say, and I don't know if the professor was saying this, but somehow like the conservative movement has been taken over, or it's a failure of the conservative movement, and certainly all of us have our failings, but I don't really see it that way. I see it much more, I said when I started talking that I'm a conservative and a Republican. I don't think they're the same thing. I'm a conservative first. My philosophy is what kind of guides my politics first, and I think the Republican Party makes sense for me to operate in. We have a two-party system roughly, and we have a center-left party and we have a center-right party. And, so I kind of view this as much more of a failing of the Republican Party. Let's face it, the party somehow lost its people. Like I said, I'm from Kansas originally. When I came to school here, I was from Kansas. And Bob Dole was the Senate Majority Leader. Do you know what happened when Bill Clinton became president? Bob Dole was a hero. You couldn't take Bob Dole anywhere in Kansas where he wasn't mobbed. And he was the Senate Majority Leader. And he was the man standing up to the Bill Clinton policies, right? I don't think you can take Mitch McConnell anywhere because he might get killed. It's just a totally different dynamic going out there. Somehow the Republican Party, it's not all their fault. As I said, we can go into some more detail on why I think Obama has changed politics a lot. I obviously think not for the better, but he's been very skillful at how he's done it. And so I think somehow the Republican leadership lost their folks. And so you have this question of Donald Trump. A lot of conservative voters, keep this in mind, which is he will receive more votes for the Republican nomination than any person who's ever run for president in the country in the modern primary system. Think about that. More votes by far. More votes than the president I served for, George W. Bush, who was the previous record holder. Our turnout is up over 60% on the Republican side. More of us are voting. 20% down on the Democratic side. There's not the enthusiasm that's the same as when the Democrats had the chance to put the first African-American president up. So I think that there is great tumult out there, and it's easy to stereotype it as, oh, Donald Trump is so outside the box that it means that like the conservative movement's falling apart. I actually think the conservative movement is, most of its adherents believe that Washington is so broken that if they send the next version of a John Boehner type Republican to Washington to solve the problems, they're just simply not equipped in this new way politics works to succeed. I think that is the primary motivation for why so many of these folks are voting for Donald Trump. It's not about all of his policies. This is not an election this cycle about policy papers. This is an election about character traits. And that's why he does so well with these voters.
That's interesting.
I'm not sure how to respond to
I didn't say these voters.
To right. Donald Trump's support being driven by character traits.
Be ready at the microphone. 10 minutes. So I'm going to turn to Dave. Dave, I know you've done a lot of work on religion in American politics, and that's another issue that's been very sort of contentious and new and different in this particular election. So there's been talk about evangelical support for Donald Trump, despite the fact that there's some ways in which he has not always been consistent with that movement. Talk about the Catholic vote and sort of what this election means for Catholics. I have a feeling that might be of interest to some of the people in the audience. Sort of what should we expect to see for sort of religion and sort of voting and voter turnout as we look ahead to the general election?
Well, let me start with the question of the Catholic vote, which, as you said, is probably of interest to at least a few in the audience here. I am regularly asked by reporters during every election season to comment on the Catholic vote. And I always give the same response, which I will give to you, which is that there is no Catholic vote. There are, however, many different Catholic votes, plural. The way you might think about this roughly is the way it was, the way it is, and then if I could just briefly talk about the way it could be. A generation, maybe 2 generations ago, it was reasonable to talk about a single Catholic vote in the United States because Catholics did generally vote as a bloc and they generally voted Democratic. That then began to change through the 1980s and 90s until we reach a point now where Catholics actually split between Republicans and Democrats. And so to speak of Catholics as a whole, which after all do constitute almost 25% of the whole population, is just a misnomer. So rather than speak of Catholics as a whole, we should think of groups within Catholics. So Latino Catholics often differ from Anglo-Catholics. Catholics who attend religious services more frequently often differ from those who are not practicing. Those who are in the north differ from those in the south. And if that sounds like the way the rest of the population differs, well, you're correct. And in fact, whenever you hear the Catholic vote described as the swing vote or the critical vote in the election because Catholics voted, for example, they in a proportion that represents the way the rest of the electorate was voting, that only underscores that Catholics as a whole resemble the rest of the country. And that's the way it is now, and in a sense, that's a success story, that Catholics were once this marginalized group that now has been fully assimilated and is in the mainstream of America and therefore fully represented in both parties. But if I could, let me just talk for a minute about the way it could be, if I could go back to my earlier theme of the fact that most Americans actually don't necessarily carry in their heads a coherent ideology that is reflected among the politicos in Washington. I think that's often especially the case for Catholics because, of course, the church takes positions that don't neatly fit into the ideological or even partisan boxes that we have in the country. And so that if you happen to be Catholic, and I suspect there are some in the audience who are, and you feel unhappy with the way the parties, or maybe your party in particular, reflects views on issues that you care about, I would encourage you to speak to your representatives and try to nudge your party in a direction that you think more accurately reflects this very large group of voters in the country, because I suspect actually that there is more opportunity for creative policy solutions that might very well be consistent with Catholic doctrine, even if it isn't necessarily Catholics pushing it, that we could find in the country. So that's what I'd say about the Catholic vote. When it comes to other religious groups, in particular evangelicals, there was a lot of talk about evangelicals and their support for Trump during the Republican primaries. It's important to draw a distinction here, though, between people who simply identify as being an evangelical Christian versus those who are participating in a religious community, who attend religious services frequently. These are two very different groups of people. So yes, Donald Trump has done very well among what we might call nominal evangelicals, people who describe themselves as evangelical, but are not actually terribly religious themselves in the sense of their behavior. They're not attending church, they're not part of a congregation. In some parts of the country, to be evangelical is just the default. That's just what people are. When you look at those evangelicals who are churchgoers, Donald Trump actually hasn't done terribly well among that group, or at least he didn't during the primaries. He'll pick up and has begun to pick up a lot of support among that group because now he's the presumptive Republican nominee, and these folks are largely Republican, and so they're likely to vote for who's at the top of the ticket. But it's important to keep in mind that he didn't initially have support among those heavy churchgoers, and that was actually true among churchgoing Mormons as well, which is why Donald Trump did horribly in the state of Utah and has done poorly in other areas of the country where you find Mormons clustered. And that's interesting to pose. Well, why would that be the case? And some of it may be that Donald Trump's positions don't line up well with this constituency, but it may also have something to do with the sort of voter that he's attracting as somebody who maybe feels a little socially isolated, and people who are involved in religious communities are not socially isolated. They often have a pretty optimistic outlook on life, and maybe the Trump message doesn't resonate so well with them.
Excellent, thank you. Luis, please.
Just a quick footnote. I think one of the ways of understanding the Catholic vote is that, as Dave said very accurately, it has become more split. But among the reasons for it being so split is because of the tremendous increase in the presence of Latino Catholics, who 2-to-1, 3-to-1, in some states 4-to-1, 5-to-1 tend to vote Democrat. So the Catholic vote has its democratic foundation in part, and that split exists in part because of the way Latino Catholics, who tend to identify as Democrat and vote as Democrat, support the democratic component of the Catholic vote. It's not to say that they vote Democrat because they are Catholics, just an interesting demographic component that helps us understand the complexity, as Dave very accurately said, the complexity of the Catholic vote in the United States today.
Not so true in Texas and not so true in Florida, at least, by the recent past, which is you have great experiences of Republicans receiving 50% of the Hispanic vote. So it is a vote that can be unlocked for Republicans, but obviously the approach that Donald Trump is taking, it doesn't seem to see how that's going to help, to say the least.
But the vote, I'm sorry, go ahead and finish your point.
The only other point I'd say is that we talk about Catholics. How do you all politicians are trying to figure out how do you attract votes, how do you unlock support groups. I don't think it helps the Democrats, who I think have by and large with the Iran deal and other things, they've taken the Jewish support that's been so reliable to them, and I know a lot of folks that are like saying, I'm rethinking who I associate with. I also think when it comes to some of these very basic questions, we have the Little Sisters of the Poor. Most folks who aren't even religious say, could you leave the Little Sisters of the Poor alone? Little Sisters of the Poor are nuns, and they primarily take care of old people who don't have any money. The idea that contraception should have anything to do with this whole conversation is a bit absurd. So there are ways in which I think common sense religious folks look at these things and say, why do we have, why is there such a split on such a basic constitutional First Amendment question amongst these parties? So I think, one of the things, again, is I think the issues that are at play will make a big determination on what people do.
So I get to control the questions for just a few more minutes, so I appreciate you indulging me. Matt, let me follow up with one question for you. For a while, although it definitely seems to be dissipating, there was this Never Trump movement.
Yes.
For those of us who study electoral history, I was reminded of Stop Goldwater, for example, which was, of course, unsuccessful in the nomination, successful in the general, and then, of course, Goldwater became the future of the Republican Party. Can you say a little bit about and of course, you worked for the second George Bush, who was staying out, he says, of this election. Talk to us about this kind of unique moment within the Republican Party.
Yeah, no, this Never Trump movement primarily started, I would say, by people on the Republican side in the Marco Rubio campaign and others, a lot of intellectual conservatives, people who write for National Review and other publications that I really revere. They hate the idea, first of all, we can get into all the ways in which Donald Trump uses language which they don't like. But I do think there's also another dynamic here for those folks that really run politics on the right. They're kind of used to doing it that way. They're used to kind of being the kingmakers. They're used to people coming to them and courting them. And Donald Trump went way over here. He went way around them. He didn't meet with any of them, hardly any of them. He did it his own way, and he did it on cable TV and everything else. And so there was kind of a revulsion from folks, and I'm sure in your own industries you understand this. There are certain ways in which things just happen, and he just bypassed those folks. So I think some folks are smart. I think there's a second dynamic, which is a lot of people, like I said initially, and the professor said the same thing, who were supposed to be smart, said, he is a joke. This will never happen. He doesn't have a chance. He had of the 17 Republicans who were running, there were other people who literally go on those debate stages and say, he is a joke. I don't take him seriously. The more those folks did that, and Never Trump was part of this, the more they helped him. Because those people who feel left behind, unprotected, not part of things, those folks who believe that their vote should matter, just as if some fancy person sitting in Washington, D.C. in a marble office building, that their vote should matter just as much. When you belittle somebody in politics, I think you actually are taking a very big risk. And there's a misconception that people weren't taking Trump on. They were, but they were taking him on by not being reverent to their people. It's the same thing Hillary Clinton has to face now, which is her goal is, as the professor said, there's a lot of people who aren't as ideologically driven as a voter like myself. And they're watching. Maybe they're not watching as much as junkies like me do, but they're watching. And you have to have a certain reverence to those folks who are at play. And don't belittle, if you belittle the person that they like and that they hear from, you're really belittling that voter. And that's what these Republicans did on the stage. They cemented this support behind Trump. And whether those same dynamics happen in the general election or not, I don't know. But I will be honest with you, he will not get the same percentage of Republicans that Mitt Romney or John McCain or George W. Bush did. He will get less. I acknowledge that. I completely acknowledge that a lot of people are reviled by the things he says. I get that. And there are people that are concerned on the right about it. But I think as every day passes, they realize in America it's a binary choice. Do they really want Hillary Clinton to fill those Supreme Court slots? Will they take a chance on Donald Trump, especially that he's released those names? This is the internal conflict that is going on. You can see it behind their eyes in Republican voters and in conservative voters. I got to take a chance. I know what the Democrat candidate is. I know exactly what she is. Can I take a chance with this guy? And that's the conflict that's going on.
Thank you. So I'm going to invite people to come forward to the microphones. And while they do, I'm going to ask one more question to Katie. I'm in this seat. We've been talking about cable television. Would you just briefly talk about what you think the role of social media has been in this election? That's been another huge one. And then I'll start acknowledging people. Thank you for your patience. And
I think social media has played a very good role and a very dangerous role in this election. And I'll start with the good news. The good news is what I mentioned about the raising money from small donors, empowering small donors. That's primarily done through social media, and the campaigns are seeing a lot of success with that. That allows small donors to feel like they're part of a system in a way they haven't been before. And if we can leverage that money with public financing, that's even more important. The bad news is I think we all use social media to reinforce our own political beliefs and our own ideologies. So we create our own echo chamber, and I think that has the potential to undermine a lot of potential for common ground among both sides. And I looked yesterday because I was curious how many people I follow on Twitter are progressive leading reporters or progressive pundits, influence makers, and it's probably 90%, to 10%. I'll start following Matt after today. But it's a self-reinforcing mechanism that doesn't help you think outside of your own echo chamber, and I think that has implications for our politics and our polarization going forward. So I think we should figure out ways to make social media more of an asset and less of a hindrance.
Thank you. Great, and I want to make sure we have time for all the questions, so I'd ask people to ask their questions. You can go ahead and sit down when you're done. If there's someone specific that you'd like to ask your question to or to the whole group, that's fine. So please, sir.
First of all, my name is John Dunn, class of 1958, 1961 law, and unfortunately, I was a chemical engineer, and I say unfortunately because I stumbled into elected office, and there were 24 years of elections, local and state level. So, as engineer walks in the door, what does he do? I searched everywhere, and the answer for me was right under my nose and right next door here. If you go to Sacred Heart Basilica, go down in the basement, we call it the crypt, in the center aisle is buried Orestes Brownson. And Orestes Brownson has a one paragraph about government, which is all you need to know. It's short. I will read it and sit down. Orestes Brownson said, "Government exists in heaven as well as on earth, and in heaven in its perfection. Its office is not purely repressive, to restrain violence, to redress wrongs, and to punish the transgressor. It has something more to do than to restrict our natural liberty, curb our passions, and maintain justice between man and man. Its office is positive as well as negative. It is needed to render effective the solidarity of the individuals of a nation and to render the nation as an organism, not a mere organization, to combine men in one living body and to strengthen all with the strength of each and each with the strength of all, to develop, strengthen, and sustain individual liberty and to utilize and direct it to the promotion of the common weal, to be a social providence imitating in its order and degree the action of the divine providence itself, and while it provides for the common good of all, to protect each, the lowest and meanest, with the whole force and majesty of society. It is the minister of wrath to wrongdoers indeed, but its nature is beneficent. and its action defines and protests the right of property. It creates and maintains a medium in which religion can assert her supernatural energy, promotes learning, fosters science and arts, advances civilization, and contributes as a powerful means to the fulfillment by man of the divine purpose in his existence. Next, after religion, it is man's greatest good, and even religion without it can do only a small portion of her work. They wrong it who call it a necessary evil. It is a great good. Instead of being distrusted, hated, or resisted, except in its abuses, it should be loved, respected, obeyed, and if need be, defended to the cost of earthly goods and even to life itself. Thank you very much. Orestes Brownson, buried right over here. That's all you need to know.
Thank you. You have a question, please?
Jim Stanton, Bachelor of Science, class of '66, Clear Lake, Iowa. I have often heard it said that the 20th century was an American century, and I, for one, would like the 21st century to also be an American century. From the standpoint of your respective academic disciplines, what is the one, or what are the one or two things that should be done to achieve that result?
Anyone like to take that?
How about one of the academics?
I use two terms to talk about what I see as the unlimited potential of our country. My father is a World War II veteran, served 2 years in Pearl Harbor during World War II, was in the Navy, was a censor during the war. He was bilingual and biliterate, and so heard messages, telephone calls going on between Mexico and the United States, would cut off the phone calls when people were talking about where they thought their sons were going to be shipped related to the war, because he said it's very important. So the country, and he worked for the Navy for 40 years subsequently, the future of the country is something that I was raised with. It's very important. Linked fate and common destiny. Linked fate and common destiny. The United States is the world's tremendous experiment in how it's going to deal with multiculturalism, multilingualism, and increasing multiracial diversity that exists. We are going to be the model and have the potential to be the model for the world. And we can see what's happening in Europe, what's happening with regards to refugees around the world, and the struggles as our country continues to have. The struggles in many countries to try to understand how to respect difference, yet keep the country together at the same time. And if one talks to younger folks, I can say that now, being 61 years old, if you can talk to the next generation of a 15-year-old son, but even talking to my daughter, who's a Notre Dame grad, you see that these sorts of differences in the next generation don't matter. And what worries me is that these differences matter so much to us that we elect leaders and prefer policies that aren't aligned with what the future of the country is actually going to be. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying differences don't matter, or that we shouldn't acknowledge differences. What I'm saying is that we have to find a way to help find common ground through respect for our differences. And I see that as a great potential for us.
Thank you.
I'm going to go to the balcony. We've got a question up here.
Hi. Looking beyond the election and assuming that the Democrats win, how do you see the reaction of this angry constituency, and who do you see leading them and in what direction?
Of which constituency?
The angry constituency that is, you know.
What happens to all those? What happens to the angry
people?
Exactly.
No? They seem pretty angry.
So your question is, you know, if the Democrats were to win, all these people who are frustrated with the establishment on the left and the right.
Right, they're not going to go away.
They're not going to go away. What does that mean for the future of our country?
Next?
Yes, that's
Right.
a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. There were a lot of Republicans who said, oh my God, if we just get rid of Trump, this whole thing's going to go away. Yeah. They still don't see what's happening out there. Right. This is real. This is people who love their country, who care about their country, who are concerned about their country. Democrats who think that this Bernie Sanders phenomenon is just going to go away as soon as Hillary Clinton maybe loses to him again in California, which could happen. You know, that's not going to go away. There's real tumult out there because, and we talked about this, look in your lives, look in your family's lives. You know, what are your kids doing? What are your grandkids doing? What are their economic prospects? Do your kids feel like, you know, that there are institutions they can trust and bond to? institutions like marriage or the church or big companies that had let them down and maybe aren't doing the types of things we'd like to see them do. This is not a question of hatred. This is not a question of people who are just isolated and somehow not advanced. We have very serious questions as a country. We ought to embrace that, and we ought to talk about it, and then we ought to try to resolve them. And I think that's what's happening in the country.
Katie.
I'll try to answer this from a policy perspective. I do think that there's going to be tremendous pressure on Congress, and there will likely still be a Republican House. There might not be a Republican Senate, but hopefully there will be a Republican White House. There's going to be tremendous pressure on them to come together and deliver an easily digestible, bipartisan policy proposal that people actually will believe will contribute to the American century. And if I were thinking about this and working on their first 100 days, I would strongly consider, for example, a widely bipartisan popular idea of investing in our pre-K generation, our young kids, every child in America who has the attention they need from age 1 to 3 to set up their skills to succeed later in life. That's the greatest determinant of whether or not they will succeed. So start early on, and a lot of Republican governors are doing this without the federal government's help. And this is something that both parties can come together that would be more than just symbolic and actually make a meaningful difference in the direction our country takes.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah.
I'm Tom Curlin, class of 66. I have lived in Washington for 35 years and have worked with some of the leadership for about 10 years, both parties. And I'm astonished that the pundits are astonished, surprised. This has been so predictable for several decades that you are essentially looking at independent, whether you call him a Bernie Sanders, you call him Donald Trump. And that really it's an election about leadership. And someone has to find that middle path, no matter how disaffected we all are, we have to find some common ground out there. But it's a choice between incremental change, which is, I think, the Democratic choice, the traditional one, or those more radical left and right. And I suspect we'll go down that middle road, with all due respect to my alma mater, which Trump is dividing and is not really a Republican. He's not a Democrat, he's an independent, and he's a businessman. And with all due respect to Obama, he said, you didn't build that, so they chose a builder. He talked about millionaires and billionaires, so they found a billionaire. He said, some people will go for guns and religion no matter what, so guns and religion are some of that base. But I suspect there's a middle ground that people are trying to find, and they're finding spokespeople who are leaders, regardless of how vulgar or off message in terms of political ideology. But we do not have those categories of Republican and Democrat. We have a strong core of independents who are looking for leadership, and we will take whichever party can provide that, not incremental, but significant leadership. And I think that's what people are responding to. I would like your reaction.
I think you should be on the panel. I completely agree.
Other comments or?
We see leadership. It's very important to distinguish between the leadership demonstrated during elections and the leadership needed for governance. And I think they're two very different sets of characteristics. To be a leader in a time of elections, you need to hit at the gut of voters. You need to be new and innovative in what it is that you're recommending. You need to take stands. It seems to me those are all helpful parts of winning the election. To the extent that those characteristics push you either to the left or to the right, it makes it harder for you to actually be a leader who can govern, who can bring people together, bring interests together, seek common ground, and have the respect of individuals who you have to deal with, members of the House, members of the Senate, and have their respect to consider working toward that common ground. What I worry about is that whoever we choose, whichever leader it is we choose, whatever set of characteristics a majority of the votes in the Electoral College choose, that there are enough extremists in the House and in the Senate and in leadership positions in the House and the Senate, that even if this leader we elect wants to work towards a middle ground, wants to work towards a compromise, those other leaders who we also choose, those other leaders won't make that possible.
Go ahead, Katie.
We could talk for hours about how to make sure that our districts are adequately diverse so that more moderates are elected to government. But I think the answer is that more Notre Dame graduates should run for public office.
Sure.
Yeah. And I run the Washington program, so if you do, please let me know. We want to network with you. So,
So I also agree that the question of leadership is critical. And, you know, when you look over the long span of American political history, we find that in most elections, most people kind of vote along with their party lines, and we can sort of predictably say that this group's going to vote for this party and this group's going to vote for this party. But then every once in a while, we'll have a great jumbling up of those coalitions. Every once in a while, you'll have a new leader come and figure out how he or she can reassemble a coalition of voters. And I suspect that the country right now is at a point where we're ready for one of these great reconfigurations, this great jumbling up of who supports whom. I don't know whether any of the current presidential candidates are really the people to pull that off, but I suspect that there are smart, capable leaders, politicians, who are waiting in the wings who will be able to capitalize on this. So I wouldn't necessarily say that this is the election where we're going to see the great tectonic plates shift, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's coming relatively soon.
Well, the Republicans certainly feel like it was.
Well, yes, but I'm thinking of someone like Franklin Roosevelt is the classic case, but Ronald Reagan did this as well. A leader who can figure out how to take people who had traditionally supported one side and bring them over to the other, and then therefore sort of come up with solutions that maybe you find support in different corridors.
and I'll step out of the moderator position for 1 minute to say that historically what we tend to see is a really disruptive election that brings in new people right before we get an election where that sort of reconfiguration that Professor Campbell's talking about happens, where the parties used to be split along these lines and now they're going to be split along these lines. We cared about slavery, now we care about economics, and we're always sort of moving around what sort of divides and defines our parties, and I have to agree that it feels like we're at a moment like that. It might be this election, it might not, but there's no question that people are sort of unsatisfied with the choices as they're currently being presented to them, and that's usually a part of that process. So I had a question here in the balcony.
Following on that question, how much longer are we going to have a two-party system?
Forever.
Yeah, a long time.
It's baked into our Constitution.
Well, Jefferson warned against it, I think. But
and then they went ahead and founded the original two parties, yeah.
Given the fact that Trump has circumvented the Republican Party, how much more control are the party leaders going to take of the potential candidates?
It's a great question.
So that's a different question, and that's an interesting one. Because prior to this election cycle, there had been I'll call them a tribe of political scientists who had argued that it's all about the party, and that really what goes on in the primaries is secondary to what the party elites are deciding. And certainly the Trump phenomenon has demonstrated that that is just wrong. Maybe it was right for a time, I don't know, but it's certainly wrong now. And I suspect that there will be other candidates looking forward in future races who will learn from the fact that Donald Trump was able to do a complete end run around the party establishment and win on the Republican side. On the Democratic side, we should note that the ongoing contest between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, that is not actually quite so unexpected. I actually think most pundits and most academics probably would have predicted that there would be a challenge to Hillary from the left wing of the party. Maybe not necessarily Bernie Sanders.
Lasting all the way to California,
well,
with her only leading for much of this race because of superdelegates. I think that's been an amazing thing to watch.
True, and so I'm not necessarily saying that I certainly didn't write anything that said this is exactly the way it's going to play out. But the race is not this year on the Democratic side qualitatively different than the race between Obama and Clinton, which did carry on for quite a long time, and it was only about now that Hillary was conceding to Obama. My point was more that the Democratic Party has a wing within it. Bernie Sanders is channeling the concerns of that wing. Now, as I said earlier, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're way off to the left, but they certainly have a different set of concerns, perhaps, than what you find among the Hillary supporters. And that race is playing out in a way that I think we would have expected. It's on the Republican side that I think we've seen the complete unexpected end run around the normal way that this is done.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you. My name is Linda Collins. I'm not a domer, but I prayed in my adolescence that I would marry one. Except that I prayed for a domer, Navy, Air Force Academy, or West Point because of the games. I got the domer. I guess I want a clarification. When we talk about the Latino vote, do we consider the Cuban vote Latino?
Yes.
Well, the Cuban vote tends to be Republican, right?
Less and less so.
Less and less so.
Less and less so. There are tremendous shifts in the Cuban American community. As many of you know, the reason that Cubans vote Republican is because of John F. Kennedy and his refusal to provide air support during the Bay of Pigs invasion. That's the primary basis for it. If you look at actual public opinion of Cuban Americans on many social issues, on issues related to government intervention, they align pretty much with many middle-of-the-road Democrats at the same time. But this issue is very important. Much less significant to the second generation of Cubans, much less significant in the second generation. And Florida is an interesting example where Latino demographic shift of Puerto Ricans moving into the state has shifted elements of the Latino vote very much more toward the Democratic Party than anyone ever thought possible in the state of Florida.
Can I just say,
there's been very little growth in the Cuban population in Florida. All of its Latino population growth has been of non-Cubans. It's true that the vote there is split about 50-50 between Democrats and Republicans, depending on the candidate, depending on the election. You can pick your election and say, here's an example of what's happening. But when you look at a number of different elections, the Latino vote in Florida is a critical vote to both the Republican and the Democratic parties.
can I just say, married to a Cuban American, if I don't speak up, she's gonna get mad at me. So it's more than just a JFK question. Ronald Reagan did several smart things to cement that vote. Many of the folks, we talk about why Hispanics vote the way they vote, why Latinos vote the way they vote. There are issues there that do line up with Republicans. There are social value questions, there are cultural questions. There's also this question about dealing with authoritarian governments that many of them flee. And my wife's father was in a Castro prison for 6 years. And he didn't care much about JFK and the Bay of Pigs. That didn't mean as much to him as when he saw the brutality of communism up close in his life, where his cellmate was assassinated before he was let out. And these are very important questions to these types of voters. And I think that once again, some of that really presents opportunities for them not to fall in lockstep with the Democratic Party.
Okay, and the second, I don't know whether it's a comment or a question, but I think that we are dealing with evil in this election, and probably ones in the past, and that we as Catholic Christians have a great responsibility to, sort this out. Maybe it's the lesser of two evils, but I know we live in an imperfect world, but I think there's a gravitas that we're not facing, that, we're talking about people's political abilities, their Machiavellian, abilities to do things that get them, where they want to go. But I think we have to really look in our hearts and see if we are supporting good or if we're supporting evil in our vote. And I know a lot of people don't want to vote because they look at the field. And so, it's a question of voting for one party or the other or not voting. And I think it's, hard.
Thank you. Any comments on?
No, I agree.
If I can quickly respond, if you look to the pamphlet that is distributed by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and they've done it very often during presidential elections, And the primary focus of that pamphlet is a call to conscience. And it's just, it challenges Catholics. Each of us is a Catholic. It challenges us to look deeply inside our own consciences when we know that it's very unlikely that any one candidate for any office is going to align perfectly with every position that our church might take and that Catholics might take if they have a very full understanding of Catholic doctrine. But it doesn't mean that you can't make choices, but it does say the choices that you make have to be driven by your own understanding of what your conscience and your faith are telling you very deep inside. I think that's wonderful advice.
I'm going to go here and then balcony.
Ralph Johnson, former governor of New Mexico, and William Weil, two-term governor of Massachusetts, were selected as the presidential and vice presidential candidates of the Libertarian Party. Do you believe, given the nature of this election year, that the Libertarian Party will have any influence at all on the election?
I do, actually. I think that the Libertarian Party has made a very smart move. Gary Johnson has run as a Libertarian before, but he's definitely a credible presidential candidate. If you've ever heard Gary Johnson speak, he doesn't come off as a wild-eyed radical. He actually comes off as quite a reasonable person. And William Weld, I would say, also fits that mold. That's not to say that I think you should be looking forward to a President Johnson in a few months from now. But I do think that in critical places, the Libertarian Party may very well get a reasonable share of the vote. I don't think they'll be quite at the level of, say, Ross Perot in 1992. He, remember, took about 19% of the popular vote. But I could see the Libertarians doing better than Ralph Nader did in 2000, and you can ask Al Gore whether he thinks Ralph Nader made a difference.
He made a difference.
In 2000. Yeah, he did. So yes, I actually do think that the Libertarians are poised as a third party that's on the ballot in most states, and my understanding is they may very well be on the ballot in all 50 states. They could very well be a spoiler in this election.
Real quickly on this whole idea of a third party, and your good question about whether there's a two-party system. You know, I'm maybe more hopeful that there could be more disruption. I think campaign finance plays a role in this two-party system too. But take all that aside. In 2016, for my friends who are Republicans and conservatives, they have this question. For those that supported somebody else in the nominating process, some of them are saying, hey, Trump isn't my cup of tea, what do I do? And for a lot of them, what it comes down to is this basic question of if they take the choice of not voting for their nominee or voting third party, they aren't taking any states away from Hillary Clinton, right? These are mostly people in red states. And so maybe they'll suppress the number of electoral votes that Donald Trump gets. But they're not going to suppress the number of votes that Hillary Clinton says. So the whole idea that this is going to kick it to the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives is going to somehow overturn the will of the ballot box or whatever, I think that's kind of like fuzzy thinking. So what it really comes down to is this binary choice. Do they, in not voting, and if you're a strong Republican and you don't vote, you're essentially helping the Democratic candidate. So this is a struggle that people, by the way, we haven't talked a lot about. It's funny thing about Trump, not only does he dominate news, he's dominating the discussion today. There's huge divisions in the Democratic side. Up to 30% of Bernie Sanders supporters are saying they don't want to support Hillary Clinton for two main reasons. She represents Washington and she represents corporate interests in Wall Street, and they don't think that's right, and they want a new voice. So there is tumult going on, and there are these types of questions being raised, I think, in both sides.
Thank you. Here on the balcony.
Thanks. Good morning, and thank you so much to this august panel. This is a fabulous subject. I'm Beth Toomey, class of '81 from Seattle, Washington, one of the most liberal cities in the country. And I am voting lesser evil. I'm an independent. I'm annoyed with both candidates. My question is, there's been a big rumor on social media this week that there's going to be this well-qualified independent jump into the race and create more havoc. So I have two quick questions. One, have you heard that? Do you agree? And who is it? The second question is, who's going to be Hillary's running mate? Is it going to be Cory Booker or Elizabeth Warner? Or do you have a third choice? Thank you.
Who's it going to be? I know who the third party is.
I'm voting
Who's
for
the running
Steve.
mate?
Yes, I'm here today to announce that it will be me. Do you know who the secret third?
Well, it's been announced.
I think it's the Libertarians.
It's this conservative writer, David French.
Oh,
who
that's right.
Writes
Yeah.
for National Review Online. He was a good guy, a good writer. I don't know him personally, but that's the person. Now, you had to love this because think about how ironic it is for Republicans. They're saying, oh my gosh, how did Trump do this? We need to have some process to figure out who a third party is. We've just been to almost every state in the land with 17 of our best people. And the voters were very clear. They gave Donald Trump the most votes. You can quibble with whether that was the right thing to do. It happened overwhelmingly, smashingly. So now you have these never Trump people saying, we've got to figure out a new Republican who can run independent. And now they came out with David French, and now all the rest are saying, well, no one's ever heard of this guy, David French. That's not a very good choice. And so now they're fighting over maybe we need a fourth choice. So I don't see great hope in what they're trying to do.
Anybody want to
The
guess?
answer is I don't know. They just started vetting, but I think that the
come
vice
on.
presidential selection is one of the more fascinating things to pay attention to and look forward to in politics.
I think you should pick Joe Biden. She should just keep him there. He's done a good job. It's not much of a job anyway. He's pretty likable. But he's not going to listen to. She's not going to listen to me though.
It's probably not going to be you, Matt. Is that what you're
Right,
saying?
that's
Okay.
right.
Question here, and then this part of the balcony.
Hi, yes. We touched on the idea that whoever is elected as president is going to have to gain the support of the House and Senate. How do we or will we see the nature and tone of this election impact elections for our congressmen and senators?
Great question.
Going forward.
You want to take this? I think this is also another fascinating thing to watch, the downstate ballot election.
I think that I'll say quickly, I'll let Kate jump in, but I think there was this assumption, you saw that Paul Ryan endorsed Trump yesterday. There was this assumption amongst Republicans that Trump, all my friends who are staffers in these Republican committees, they assumed that Trump would be a disaster down ballot. Everyone's got to run from him and everything else. And what they're actually seeing is that they're hearing from a lot of constituents. Once again, it's kind of like this 60-40, 80-20. They're not 100% for Trump, but they're 80% for Trump, or they're 60% for Trump. There's a lot about this kind of outside idea that they like. And so I think Paul Ryan's been hearing from members, which is, hey, we need to just pull off the Band-Aid and embrace reality and take the good out of it, because there's plenty of good out of it as well. And I think there are Democrats on the other side who are hearing a lot from Bernie Sanders supporters that the superdelegate system on the Democratic side is corrupt, and it shouldn't be these oligarchical figures that determine your nominee. It should be the voters. And I think, once again, so I think both of those nominees, there's an assumption that there could be some harm. I think at the end of the day, it's actually going to be more standard than normal, or as normal.
So I think the House and Senate are a little bit different here, but the Senate Democrats seem to pick up 4 more seats to flip the Senate back to being Democrat. And I think there's probably, the field has widened now that Trump's the nominee in terms of seats that they can capture. And the NRSC, which is the campaign committee for the Senate Republicans, was reportedly telling these Republican incumbents to not talk about Trump, do not talk about the national debate, and just focus solely on local politics to get reelected. So the conventional wisdom in DC is that the Senate has a very good chance of flipping. I don't know how much of it will be blamed on Trump or not, because a lot of these states are hard states for moderate Republicans. But I would say that I think on Tuesday night, the media is going to declare Hillary Clinton the Democratic nominee.
Does she win California?
And that everything is going to be okay.
She's going
with
to win?
Bernie Sanders voters.
Is she going to win?
I'll put my money on her winning.
On California?
And,
Okay.
and she doesn't actually need to win California to win the nomination on Tuesday night, because the combination of delegate votes across New Jersey, D.C., and California will push her over the edge. The media will declare her the winner. It's questionable what Sanders will do after that, but everything will be okay. The Democrats are going to get behind Hillary Clinton as the presidential nominee.
You heard it here. Mm-hmm. You heard it here.
And so will President Obama.
34 seats are up in the Senate in this election. 24 are Republican seats. Only 10 Democrats are up. So that's one of the reasons that
24 Republicans defending as opposed to just 10 Democrats.
They're more in some states, Pennsylvania,
Tough states.
Florida,
New Hampshire, Indiana.
they're states where the Democrats, if they have the right candidate, might be able to switch a Republican seat.
Wait.
Yeah,
Oh, I'm
all right,
sorry.
that's all right.
No, please go ahead. If you don't mind, I've got time for both of you, so we'll go here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
My name is Joe Bodell, class of '66. I'm from the city of brotherly love, also known as Philadelphia. And I voted for Bernie Sanders in the Pennsylvania primary. My question for Matt is, as I listened to you, and I wanted to thank everyone for their presentations, my question to Matt was, you said that belittling people is not a winning strategy. How do you explain Trump? From my point of view, beginning with John McCain, through Megyn Kelly, through the disabled reporter, ad nauseum, his strategy is to belittle people. And is so transparently pathological. What could he, assuming he is thinking, is there any strategy to belittling people as he has consistently done?
Well, I'm not, as I've said, he is not on trial, and I'm not his character
Oh,
witness.
I'm not
Let me go here. Let me go here. I'm not his character witness. I have said publicly many times when I disagree with him. I don't teach my kids to talk like that. I have 5 little girls. I think we're having all kinds of conversations. I'll be honest with you. Once again, it's a binary choice. And I think he also is giving voice to a lot of people in the country who are really concerned about the economy, about jobs, about whether, let me just keep going.
No,
I'll give you your time back.
all that.
Whether America can still lead into the next century, whether or not we understand what we need in terms of our security, whether or not we understand what's happening overseas. And let's face it, what's happening with the court and the culture and the right to life and the institution of marriage and all these basic questions. There's been a lot of change in America in a short period of time. I think the people who have risen up to support Trump, not just Republicans, a lot of independents, I think you will see a lot of union voters on the Democratic side too, who he will be able to attract. I think it is wrong to assume that these people are being motivated because he made fun of a reporter with a handicap. I don't think that is what the fundamental thrust of this is. I think what the fundamental thrust of this is that there are a lot of Americans who have a legitimate concern about where we're going, and they don't see getting there with the types of Republicans that we've been nominating.
And he concludes that the best way to get his message across is to belittle people.
Look,
I mean, that's what follows. He concludes. Thank you.
I understand where you're coming from.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. And again, I apologize if I'm not calling on, but I promised up here, so please.
Good morning. Thank you. My name is David French.
There he is.
The movement starts here.
Not really. And I didn't have to pray in my adolescence to be married to a donor, but I do thank the good Lord for that. There was mention of the lack of a cohesive ideology. Sorry, I didn't catch your name, sir, but is that to be in any way equated with the demise or the diminution of the middle class? And I'll put that out as a question. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
So what I was describing is the fact that most people, the overwhelming majority of people, not just in the United States, but anywhere, do not carry around in their heads a coherent political ideology in the way that parties might espouse, or a pundit might, or an academic might. Certainly there's some share of the population who do, and those people are often highly active in politics, so we hear from them a lot, but most people don't actually line their views up along a strictly right-wing perspective or a left-wing perspective, which again is how you can get candidates appealing to people on the other side of the partisan spectrum. So that's what I meant by the coherent ideology, and that I would say is more or less a consistent thing. We've known this. We collectively as social scientists for many, many, many decades, and it isn't really a function of the political context. It's just the way people are. However, you are correct that there has been, really by any metric, a decline in the middle class. And if I could just circle all the way back to one of our earlier questions that was asked about what would make the 21st century to also be an American century, I would say, and I suspect that both the left and the right would agree with this, that bolstering the traditional concept of the middle class in the United States is absolutely critical to ensuring that America maintains not only its economic prosperity, but also our civic and cultural flourishing. That it's just really important to have a nation where we don't have a small number of very wealthy people at the top and a large number of working class people at the bottom who have no hope of ever climbing that ladder, but rather if we kind of restore that dream. And that's going to require creative policy solutions on both the left and the right. I really do not think that that's a red or a blue issue. It's really a purple issue.
Please, ma'am.
I'm not a domer. I'm married to a domer of 66. And
Is he an answered prayer?
No, actually not. I'm actually not. Despite the fact that I was a progressive that didn't think I would marry a Catholic, but I have to say I'm very happy for his Catholic upbringing because I think it represents something that I thought was special. And I read, I read something that made me feel really good about the spirit of inclusion that was said here for Notre Dame. And it was talking about being inclusive, and that's what I think Christianity is involved in, is being inclusive and forgiving. And it really bothers me very much that that's not what I see in some of the policies that have been what I see in Republican. It was the problem with the Republican Party. I believe in health care for all, even though I'm not a Bernie supporter. I like him, but I'm not. I think Hillary's the best one. I'm very out there about that. And he's probably dying right now because I am. He has actually run for office as a Democrat in Texas, which is a little difficult because of the redistricting and the gerrymandering. But, I feel like I would like to see that forgiving, inclusive be a part of both parties. And I think it was at one time in the Republican Party. I think it's sort of lost its direction.
Thank you.
You mind if I think that those are beautiful comments, obviously heartfelt. And I do think we've had a shift. I don't know what sets of issues you brought up some, but I do think we've had a shift in the question of how the culture plays in politics. And for a long time, there were a lot of Catholic Democrats who wanted to be strongly uphold the right to life. Joe Biden was one of those Democrats early in his career. And we've seen since Roe v. Wade, since 1973, very little change in law. Basically, abortion is legal throughout almost the entire pregnancy in most states. And then you have this question about traditional marriage, First Amendment. How do you want to practice your religion in this society? And as conservatives, we have conservatives who are social conservatives, and we have more libertarian conservatives who are less comfortable on these cultural questions. I am a practicing Catholic. I take a socially conservative view on those questions. That being said, America has a real opportunity here. Gays are allowed to serve in the military. I think we'll soon see that we'll have more protections for gay and lesbians in the workforce. As these changes are made, I won't embrace all of them, but as they're made, you know what I'd love to see America do? Double down on the First Amendment, which is if you want to live your life as a faithful Christian, the government should stay the heck out of your way. And if you want to live your life as someone who doesn't really want to interact with religion, the government ought to stay the heck out of your way. We ought to be able to run our businesses as we like. We ought to be able to raise our children as we like. The nuns, the Little Sisters of the Poor ought to be able to run their mission outreach as they want. And I think America has a real chance to get back to what made it great. I appreciate all the talk about diversity, and I think racial diversity is important, but America was always diverse. And where was it the most diverse? People came from all over the place, yes, mostly Europe, but they had all kinds of faiths. Obviously mostly Christian faith, but we had early examples of people that said, I don't really want to have a Christian faith. And that is part of what makes America exceptional. It's not because we're the best. It's because we're just so different. And the fact that you can come here and be that. And I think through all these questions, if America could double down on the First Amendment, I think we'll be better.
I'm about to be really unpopular. I can take one more question. You can all put it on your student evaluations about what a bad teacher I am. And I've been there. It's all right. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. I apologize for those of you waiting.
Hello, Michelle Granger, class of 2011. I would like to take a moment to shift our focus to the international stage, because I think the selection of a president is very much tied in with our reputation as a nation. And on the one hand, we have our ability to mobilize our allies, but also to defend against those who would be enemies of our country. Assuming that Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton are our potential presidents, what implications do you see in terms of either of them being president, their ability to mobilize our allies, and what the selection of either of those candidates as president would mean for enemies of our nation?
And you have 20 seconds to answer that question.
Well, I think no one is better suited to solidify our international reputation than our former Secretary of State, who has done an amazing job on the international stage and in getting to repair and restore some relationships that needed to be repaired and restored when she was Secretary of State, and to creating and fostering new ones. And she has a lot of respect in the international arena. And I'm very, very uncomfortable with Trump, largely for the implications it would have for our leadership in the world. And it frightens me that, I won't even go into much detail, but it frightens me that he's getting accolades from people like Putin and Kim Jong-un. And I think that's very scary, and we should be concerned about that.
Glad I'm not alone.
You gonna go? So I want to thank all of you again for coming out this morning. I want to remind you that there are evaluation forms about this event that you can fill out as you leave. Please do that. It's so helpful to the reunion committee to sort of get your sort of feedback. And then would you just join me in once more thanking our panelists for their time and their expertise.
I'm clapping for you.
In closing, remember, the surveys are really important to us, because if you liked this, we'll do more of it, and if you didn't, we'll take a cue there. But as you fill those surveys out, it's about the seminar itself and not their politics.
Yeah. Never talk about politics or religion, but at Notre Dame, we do everything different. So again, thank you for coming, and have a wonderful, wonderful reunion weekend.
Thank you.